Hello, everyone. I'm Marc Andrus. I'm the Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of California, which is the Episcopal Church in this Bay Area around San Francisco. And I'm talking with you just on the sort of eve before the deputation and I head to Baltimore for the General Convention of the Episcopal Church. And I have a few thoughts about why this is such an important General Convention. Here in the Bay Area, it's possible that we responded to COVID-19 sooner than anyone in the nation, because the mayor of San Francisco, the Honorable London Breed, put San Francisco under so-called lockdown before any other major city in the United States. And the church responded vigorously, immediately. So the COVID-19 response team, I formed that, and Stephanie Martin-Taylor was a very big part of that. The Reverend Jane McDougall chaired it, and we were meeting twice a week right away, but it didn't all flow from Dio House. The congregations of the Diocese of California were immediately responsive. And as I've said, I think history will look back at the diocese and the Bay Area in general and say that we saved many, many lives. And so I really think that is the case. We also learned things. And this General Convention is going to be a place where we are living into those kinds of strictures in response to COVID-19, and I think we're learning things. So many of us in the Episcopal Church for many, many years, long before I was involved in General Convention, have been aware that the length of time and the necessity to travel to wherever the convention is being held disadvantaged people from taking part. Yes, there's support for deputies to be able to travel, but not everybody can take off work, and not everybody can leave their families. And so we say we want young adults to take part in General Convention. We say we want everyone of all economic backgrounds to be able to take part in General Convention, represent their diocese. And the reality is that's just not true, possible when you've got a 2-week General Convention and it's all in person. So suddenly the presiding bishop and the president of the House of Deputies and the Executive Council have cut General Convention in half. We will be meeting 4 days, almost entirely for legislative measures rather than for the kind of gathering of the church, the familial gathering of the whole wider church that we normally, as a big piece of the normal General Convention. And I think we should take a lesson from this. 2 things. I know that we have not had the canonical means to do voting by hybrid or remote. We're going to make that possible moving forward. That's a great thing. But even this shortened time tells us we could do that, that we could make a General Convention, since we're doing it, that could be substantially shorter than in the past, which would mean people like Adia and others, young adults, could take part in the General Convention in a way that we have not made it possible for them to take part really before. So necessity is the mother of invention, as they say. So we are being pushed, and I hope we learn a big lesson from this. It's not ideal. The bishops are going to stay in a bubble, and the deputies are going to stay in a bubble, and I won't be able to meet with the California deputation in person during those 4 days. That came as a bit of a shock to me when the deputation told me. They were kind of like, now, Bishop, you understand you're not going to be able to meet with us. I was like, no, I did not understand that. So some of this is unnatural. Some of it will fade away, we pray, when we move into the General Convention in 2024, but some of it should teach us how we should move forward in a new way. That is, taking advantage of the technology that places like the Bay Area have pioneered for the whole world, and also being more mindful of what genuine participation looks like for young adults, for people who don't have control of their work or their family environments in ways that would allow them to participate in a 2-week-long General Convention. So we could become more diverse in the future with our General Convention. I do think that that whole gathering of the family is losing that is something that we all want to come back. We are not just a legislative body. We are a legislative body, and I take the legislation of the Episcopal Church really seriously, and I want to come back to that in a moment. But it's just as important that we have a sense of ourselves as the family of God, or part of the family of God, and coming together to sing, to pray, to celebrate the sacraments together, to just spend time together is important. So I hope that will come back. I trust it will, and we'll find ways for that to happen. That's just not possible today. On the legislation, when I was elected a bishop back in 2001 and consecrated in early 2002, I had never been to a General Convention. And my first General Convention was 2003, a famous General Convention when Gene Robinson was confirmed as the Bishop of New Hampshire. And even then, so for all those years ago, I started hearing people say, all these legislative items, they're so what? They call them so what legislation. So what that the Episcopal Church thinks anything about anything. I really, really have a different opinion about that. As you know, I spend a lot of energy on advocacy around climate change and environmental degradation, on status of immigrants, on racial reconciliation, gender equity. In all of these areas, when I advocate in civil society, when I go and meet with legislators in Washington or here in their home offices, I am able to say, this is not just Marc Andrus's opinion. This is the settled opinion of the entire Episcopal Church. And we have a body of legislation that provides a policy platform on which we stand. And so it matters a lot more when I can say to Speaker Pelosi, this is the Episcopal Church's position, not just my position. So I think this is enormously important. I wrote a piece of legislation for the last General Convention, numbers of pieces, but one of them was on the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And these goals are now part of the policy platform of the Episcopal Church. And that allows our Office of Government Relations, it allows lay people in the Episcopal Church, priests, bishops, deacons, to take a stand and to speak to their legislators in their states and in Congress about the Sustainable Development Goals, really important areas about human life, about the environment, about women, about children, about education, all of that. So I think this legislative work is incredibly important. We've moved at the urging of our presiding bishops much of the legislation onto the consent calendar, meaning that we'll just vote consent on it and it'll be passed. I think that's great. We needed to do it to meet this compressed legislative schedule. I also think there's a little problem with that, in that we will pass things almost by necessity that we have not looked at very carefully. and it's not that I want debate or, like any of these to be defeated necessarily, but I do want people to really know what these pieces of legislation are so that they can own them and care about them and carry them back to the dioceses that they represent. That's going to take some work out of this General Convention to help people see how important some of these pieces of legislation are. There's a real possibility that they'll just be lost in the shuffle. Yes, we passed that, but I wasn't even really aware because it's hard to read hundreds of pieces of legislation carefully.
Talk a little bit about the Diocese of California's influence on this convention, other conventions. I've been so aware of how mind-bogglingly busy our particular delegation has been creating legislation, weighing in on legislation. And I get the sense that that is unusual.
It's very unusual. I don't want to do California exceptionalism or say we're better than any other diocese, but it is true that the deputation from the Diocese of California is outstanding in its level of engagement. The number of pieces of legislation that originate from within the Diocese of California is extraordinary. And that's true this General Convention. There are quite a few across several areas of justice. But it's also true that the deputation is super engaged. I think every one of the deputation is on a committee, and if not on a committee, some of them are chairing committees, but they're also monitoring committees. So every committee of the General Convention has some deputy of the deputation from the Diocese of California that is looking carefully at every piece of legislation, excuse me, in those coming out of those committees, and has analyzed them, has opinions on them, and is informing the whole deputation and me, so that we have a sense of what this legislation is, how important it is, where its weaknesses are, where its strengths are. It is remarkable.
One of the things that I really love about our deputation is the fact that they're so involved. But that also shows that there's a lot of young adults and people in our diocese that never have been to convention, don't care to really understand convention. And when people ask them, do you want to be part of the deputation for convention, they're like, oh, I'm not really interested in that, because they don't really understand how you as a bishop would encourage people to get more involved in the future of our church and what it means to be part of this great gathering that we do every couple of years.
Thanks, Adia. It's a fact that in our civil society, especially at the national level in the United States, not to mention any of the other 17 nations that make up the Episcopal Church, that many young people feel disenfranchised, that their vote doesn't matter. So they've stopped showing up to vote in our national life, and probably in their local legislative bodies as well, at the very local state level. At the church level, we're not vast like the United States. It's not a small church. When people say, 2 degrees of separation or whatever, and they say, oh, it's such a small church. Well, no, none of us is intimate with 2.5 to 3 million people. That's not true. But it is a deeply interconnected church, and it's not so big that any young person who wants to can make an effect, can make an impact. They can, and they do. I serve on the legislative committee. I think it's number 20. I'm the secretary for it, the bishop secretary, on environmental concerns. And we had a last minute piece of legislation offered, which passed our committee. We put it on the consent calendar. It came from a young deputy, I believe in his 20s, and he spoke very passionately to our committee. And he garnered our full support. So there's an example. This young person had an opinion. He felt passionately about it. He wrote the legislation. He got some support from his own diocese. He brought it to a legislative committee. It is now on the calendar, the consent calendar. It will almost certainly be passed. It's about the Green New Deal and getting support from the Episcopal Church for the Green New Deal. Well, there's an advocacy piece that could be really useful for him in his own estate, and for me in this state to be able to go and say, the Episcopal Church is behind the Green New Deal, and here's what it means, and then how do we change our own lives to support that? So I would say it's important for me and for us to encourage young adults to see that they can and do make a meaningful difference in the life of our church. And the path is pretty open for them. They're not insurmountable, even significant barriers. And we're, as I said in the opening statements, I think we are in the moment where we can take down even more barriers for participation.
Yeah, one of the things that strikes me about our governance is that it is a great training ground potentially for folks, young folks especially, who would like to go into deeper into civic life and grassroots organizing. It's a great place to start. Everyone has to start somewhere, and the Episcopal Church offers tremendous opportunity for leadership at a young age.
Yeah, that's a tremendous point, Stephanie, Diane. The idea that this is a training ground, and for our diocese to work with the highly engaged people on our deputation, I just think that would be an enormous gift for anybody, any age, to get into that group and learn the legislative process. It's interesting to think that our church, the Episcopal Church, was born almost at the same moment that this country was born. And the way I like to say this is that we are the most democratically evolved province of the Anglican Communion. So there are like 39 provinces of the Anglican Communion. We are one, and we are not just the United States, we're 17 countries. And we have been, as a church, evolving as a democratic body. So we're this funny thing. We ordain people to the episcopate, to the priesthood, to the diaconate, and we say that like is a thing that has to do with being. Like we are that. Like we don't serve just a term, like 4 years as a bishop or a priest or a deacon. We are bishops, priests, deacons, lay people. At the same time, we elect all of our bishops. We elect all of our congregations, elect their priests. This is what we do. This is not the case in every province of the Anglican Communion. We are different, and we're still evolving. So somebody who gets legislative experience in the Episcopal Church, it's relevant. It's relevant experience for the civil society because these two bodies, the Church and the United States and states, are evolving democratically, not exactly the same, but at the same time. And I think it has made us a very different church than our siblings in the Anglican Communion, and I'm grateful for it.
Talking about what's coming up for General Convention, one of the more controversial issues has been the conversation about communion to not baptize members. So what is your view on that, and how do you feel about this issue being brought up to General Convention this year? And especially because a lot of people have said there's other more important issues that the church should be focusing on during this time.
Yeah.
And there's two sides of the coin on that issue.
A great question. It's a great question for me as the bishop of this diocese, because many people don't realize that the so-called open communion movement started in this diocese. It started with one woman writing one book called Take This Bread, Sarah Miles, who is part of St. Gregory of Nyssa here in San Francisco. In that book, she talks about how as a person who was not part of the church, she was welcomed to the table at St. Gregory's, and this was what encouraged her, that openness and that welcome, without sort of, you must do this, you must do this. It was just, Jesus welcomes you to the table, to the table of Jesus Christ. And then everything else about the church started to open up for her. I was elected and came to this diocese in 2006, and I think that was the year her book came out. So I came into this diocese with people saying, open communion, and by the way, Bishop, what do you think about that? And I was formed as an Episcopalian with the rubric that is in the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer, that only baptized Christians are welcome to the Eucharist, to the table. So I said, the rubrics are important. And one layperson sat down with me and said, Bishop, this is how I see it. Jesus, as I read the Gospels, went around taking down barriers to communion. And he ate, as it says, he ate and drank with sinners. And he changed people's hearts by that, we could say, radical embrace and welcome. And this person ended by saying, it seems to me he took away barriers rather than putting them up. And I had nothing to say to that. I think that was for me at least, it was a very compelling argument. It was widely accepted very quickly. The presiding bishop at the time supported the idea, Catherine Jefford Shorey, of open communion. At least in this diocese, it's, I think, a universal practice. I can't speak to the whole Episcopal Church's practice, but it is widely used, and for the reasons essentially that I have just said. The arguments that have been put forward recently, at least on social media, and I acknowledge that those don't go so deep and maybe don't represent the more substantive arguments against open communion. The main one that's been put forward is this has been part of the church, that is, baptism as the entry into the other sacraments, and especially the Eucharist, has been part of the church since the 5th century. Well, this is not a theological argument, in my view. We didn't ordain women for almost 2,000 years. That didn't mean we were right. We were wrong. So the fact that we've done this since the 5th century is not a theological argument. It's just a fact of history. So we've got to do better than that as to why we need that entryway into the communion. Now, Adia, your other question was, well, why is it important for us to take up our time talking about this? That's a great question. I recently preached on Trinity Sunday about the Nicene Creed. And I have to say, there are active, that discussion about why do we need the creed, or I don't like the creed, and we shouldn't say the creed, that is a very alive thing. I hear it all the time. Almost every visitation that I make to a congregation, somebody says, do we have to say the creed, or like that? The question I asked myself in preparing for that Trinity Sunday sermon was, why did they go to so much trouble to create the creed? Especially this piece about, the first piece about the nature of Jesus, of Christ. Is Christ of God or a creation of God? And why did that matter so much? So 1,800 people in the year 325 travel from many places in the world to attend the council at Nicaea, which is in modern day Turkey. They couldn't fly there, they couldn't drive there. It was dangerous and difficult to travel that far. Passions were high. One person was murdered as part of the Nicene disagreement. Another person was imprisoned so that he couldn't speak and make his views known. So why would they care so much? Well, they cared so much because in part, the words that Jesus, the Logos, the message of Jesus that we get from the Gospels, it matters whether it's just me, a person like me, like you. I respect you deeply, but it matters whether it's a person speaking his, her, their own personal view, or if this comes from God. And the idea that the messages of Jesus are the messages of God. As in the Gospel of John, Jesus says, what I say is being said by the Father. Well, that means that Jesus's messages on equality, on justice, on care for each other, respect for each other, in as much as you do it to the least of these, you do it to me, that is coming straight out of the divine. If we believe that Jesus is part of God's self. So it matters. And so open communion is not a trivial thing. It's talking about a channel to participation in the life of God, and how we are able to do that or not able to do that. And what does that mean? So I think it matters a great deal. If we say it doesn't matter, then we have to ask, why are we doing these things? I mean, like, why are the sacraments so central in our church? Are they just over here and life is over here? Or does what happens in church around the sacraments empower us to be the ambassadors of God, to be the hands of Christ, the mouth, the feet of Christ? And I think this is what we believe. Was that a little too impassioned? I'm not on the theology committee. And that's probably the presiding bishop's very wise to not put me there.
I think that actually segues well into back to convention and the whole purpose of why we do this, because it can get very in the weeds. It can feel it, as you know, it can be uncomfortable, tense, political. How do you bring it back to the spiritual level and to the essential in your mind?
Well, I said that we were going to kind of be separated this year and not do so much of the family of God work, and the legislative work is going to be to the fore, and almost everything that we do. That's true, but I don't want to make too sharp a distinction between the two. In more Protestant denominations, you often hear you've gone from preaching to meddling. If a person is preaching a message that is deemed too political. And what I want to say to that, I've said it many times, is that there is no human action that is not political, and no human statement that is not political, because polis, the Greek word for the city, is not just about places that have defined city definitions like San Francisco or Oakland or Berkeley or New York, or any city. It's about human life. And Aristotle, the Greek non-Christian philosopher, said that humans are social by nature. We are social. We are created as a social, we're not solitary. We live in society. And so when we say that we're political, it means that we are living human life. We are living in broadly speaking, the polis. And we have responsibilities to live that life. So, you know, the word liturgy, as every Episcopalian has been trained, comes from a compound Greek word that means the work of the people. And in the civic life, the polis in Greece, you had a citizen had certain responsibilities, and that was their liturgy, the work of them as a person. So you might be responsible for the annual poetry festival or the Olympics, or, you know, some kind of civic activity that needed to happen because it was partly what defined the city, the political life. And you had a responsibility for that. That was the work of you as a citizen. Well, that's us in the church life and in our general lives. We have work that is essential for us to be part of a human society, to be social people. And so this is what we're doing in the General Convention. We're living the political life of the church, and there is no other life. There is no life that is not that. So it's a really false idea that we can separate politics from the life of the church. I do, however, want to say, I do get the idea of a place that is not party. So Bishop Curry has said he's making, when he makes a statement, he's not making a partisan statement. He's making a statement about policy, but not partisan. So it's not a political party. I agree with that. And I heard from our senior senator in California, Senator Feinstein, many years ago when we first moved here. I heard that she had left her home congregation. She's part of a Jewish, she was part of a Jewish congregation here in the city. And I understood that it was because she didn't have any peace when she got into the synagogue, that it was too much of the issues unrelentingly of the day. And of course, that was her life. That is her life. She's living in the political completely. And she needed something that nurtured her and didn't fall into partisan politics. And she needed something that refreshed her, gave her the sense that wasn't divorced from political commitments, but wasn't unrelentingly of what she did in the Senate all the time. So I get that. People need to come into a space where they feel safe, where they feel respected, despite their party. So there's a distinction. I'm not saying that we go in and slug it out over political views, or as the rector of the parish in Williamsburg, Bruton Parish in Williamsburg, Virginia, did during the Vietnam War. I wasn't there, but I heard that he lectured President Johnson about the war while President Johnson was there. Okay, maybe he did the right thing to do that. But there is a place where lay people feel that they're somewhat defenseless when they're in the church, and the person with the pulpit, whether it's a priest, a deacon, a lay person, the person with the pulpit can say what they want. We need to be respectful of some human boundaries and the need to not take advantage of the pulpit to press upon people in certain ways. And I probably violated that at times. So I hope I'm making sense. So we are political, but we need to be respectful of humans when we engage in political activity. And the work of the legislation of the General Convention is essentially political work, and that means it can also be spiritual church work at the same time.
Of all the things that are happening, that will happen at General Convention, what are you looking forward to the most?
I don't know, Adia. I'm a little in a bit of a fog about it because it is so different, right? I mean, like when I met with the deputation and they told me I couldn't meet with them at General Convention, we could get on computers between two rooms and see each other. I'm not exactly sure what it's going to be like. I'm deeply committed to the committee I'm working on, the legislative committee, and we have, I think there's 7 resolutions. We've filed them all. I filed them all as the secretary from the bishops. They all originated in the House of Bishops. We laid down a huge platform for environmental work at the last General Convention, and we're adding to it with this one. I'm really happy about that, and I'm grateful for the work of that committee. I'm eager to see the California deputation swing into action as they already have done, but there and do their beautiful work. I'll be glad to see the bishops that I can visit with. There's some great friends. Bishop Gallagher, Carol Gallagher, the first Indigenous woman bishop in the world. And we're in the same class. We were consecrated the same year. She just celebrated her 20th anniversary as a bishop, and we're long and dear friends all those 20 years. I'll be so happy to see her and many others. So there will be some gathering, like in a limited way. That will be great. We'll be electing a new President of the House of Deputies. I'm excited about that. I'm glad we can do that. I think we've got good candidates, and I trust that a wonderful new President of the House of Deputies will be called, chosen, elected. I think we will enable us to move forward to the next General Convention with this hybrid ability to vote. That's an incredibly important thing that we will do, I think, at this General Convention, because it'll change how we behave in the future. I'm glad to be in Baltimore. Despite what our former president said, it's a great city. It's a great diocese. I love Baltimore. We lived outside of DC and in that area for many years. And I just know it's a great city and a great diocese. And it's so much to put on a General Convention. You know, the hosting of a General Convention is, I just think it's staggering to think about how much work it is. And I'm just very grateful for their hospitality. Looking forward to being there. And blue crabs maybe are better than Dungeness crab. You know, people are going to resent me saying that, but it is my opinion.
Well, safe travels. We wish you a wonderful experience within this brave new world of hybrid and uncharted territory. And just thank you for all you're doing. And we really look forward to hearing how it goes.
Well, thank you so much for this time. Can I conclude with one statement? I want to say thank you also to our presiding officers for making and for the Secretary of the General Convention, our own Michael Barlow, for making us as safe as we can be in this General Convention. Some of us will be headed off to Lambeth in the latter part of July, and there are some provisions for COVID safety for Lambeth, but nothing like what our presiding officers and the Secretary of the General Convention have done for us.
I hope you can join us after General Convention so we can, catch up on what happened.
I'll look forward to it.
Yes.
And thank you both so much.
Thank you, Bishop.
Thank you, Bishop Marc.